Matt Higgins.
Matt Higgins.
Matt Higgins.
Matt Higgins.
What I was doing between the first plane hitting the tower and the collapse was standing on the corner 3 blocks away on Church and Park, alone with 2 aides, with the building as the backdrop, like horrific. But you have a job to do, and the job to do is to represent strength and to set a press conference. And that was always the mayor's philosophy, and I credit him for it. I've taken it with me in every context, that the first rule of crisis management is to show up.
This is Get Mic'd, a podcast about the ins and outs of what it takes to build a notable brand. I'm your host, Katie Zeppieri, and I'm also the founder and lead publicist of the MicDrop agency. In today's episode, I chat with Matt Higgins. Matt Higgins is a serial entrepreneur and growth equity investor as co-founder and CEO of the private investment firm RSE Ventures. He is also an executive fellow at the Harvard Business School, where he co-teaches the course Moving Beyond Direct-to-Consumer, and was a guest shark on ABC's 4-time Emmy Award-winning TV show Shark Tank seasons 10 through 11. Early in his career, Matt was the youngest mayoral press secretary in New York City to Mayor Giuliani at the age of 26, where he managed the global media response to the September 11th terrorist attacks. After leaving politics, Matt spent 15 years in senior leadership positions with National Football League teams. He made his mark as executive vice president of business operations for the New York Jets, and then went on to serve as vice chairman and minority owner of the Miami Dolphins. Matt recently launched his first book, Burn the Boats, Toss Plan B Overboard and Unleash Your Full Potential, which is an actionable playbook for taking risks and achieving massive success. This was an energizing interview with Matt, where we spoke about the lessons Matt learned about crisis communications from his time working as Mayor Giuliani's press secretary during 9/11, the ways Matt has been intentional about building his personal brand, and how his call to action, Burn the Boats, can be applied to taking risks in building your brand. Matt truly delivered dozens of actionable takeaways. I hope you enjoy listening. Matt Higgins, welcome to Get Mic'd.
Thanks for having me. This is like a historic moment when we look back, and you're massive. I was early.
I love that spirit. So you have been involved in so many different industries, from politics to sports to entertainment to media to tech. Plus, you also have a really strong personal brand. We're looking at your book in the background there behind you that you just recently launched, Burn the Boats. How much has marketing and branding been a part of your career journey? And what is your approach to building brands across such diverse sectors?
Such a good question. Yeah, my range of experiences, people often wonder, like, how does it all fit together? Part of why I wrote the book was to explain how it all fits together, that there's a method to this madness, and then there's an underlying formula, this burn the boats, unrelenting, commitment, which we can get into. But marketing, branding, and its cousin, communications, is actually huge. On my desk is a typewriter from the turn of the century, because I feel like I owe so much to communications. When I was a kid growing up in poverty in 5th grade, just destitute circumstances, the first recognition I got from the outside world about maybe my skills were exceptional in one area was writing. And I won a Stewart Hall essay scholarship. I still remember this. I was only in 5th grade. It was $1,000. So anyway, being able to use my PR and communication branding skills on my behalf was really a turning point in my career, because I made the decision that isn't it better to use those skills on my behalf than it is to use them on behalf of others. So I'm like an AI set. I got trained on these larger than life figures in different contexts, and then the AI just ran amok and created all these crazy careers.
I think it's interesting to learn about how you got started. You were a high school dropout, but this wasn't just something that you woke up one day and decided to do. This was intentional. You thought about this and you had a plan about getting into the workforce. You talk about, taking care of your mom, providing for your family. And when I was learning more about your journey, politics seemed to be one of the places where you really got your start. I'm wondering, how did you get into politics in the first place? How do you go from being a high school dropout to getting into politics?
Great question, and I agree about politics, so we can dive into that a bit. Grew up, dirt poor. People throw these words around; they don't mean anything. But I always say I grew up on government cheese. I keep the box not the cheese, but the box on my desk, courtesy of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, big block of cheese. But so real destitute and doing odds and ends jobs, selling flowers on street corners, whatever it would take. Because I was the one, I didn't have much, but you were all given some gifts from the universe, nature versus nurture. I don't know. But for me, it was defiance. I always felt like I didn't belong here, not in an arrogant way, like I was better than my cohort in my neighborhood. It was more just, it was this sense like it doesn't have to be this way and it won't be this way. And there was always a little bit of an otherness about me and didn't feel like I needed to be shaped by these circumstances. So I became very much an observer of my environment. Maybe that's somewhat of a trauma response, protective response. And so as I was finding my way and scratching and crawling out of poverty, I discovered my writing skills and I would start leveraging that. And the first job I got, significant job, was to work for a congressman's newspaper that he created. He had went on to become a congressman, but it was called the Queen's Tribune. And they gave me this job as a muckraking reporter. People would send me their clips about problems they were dealing with. They literally had to fill out a little coupon that told me, like, I've got overgrown trees and they're blocking the stop sign. Somebody's going to die. It was like, but within these little coupons, it was called the Trib Action Desk, were these incredible nuggets of like real, not wrongdoing per se, but really sad stories where people's complaints weren't being listened to. And I realized I had no power as a little reporter in a Queens newspaper. But if I would team up with a New York Times reporter or one of the major newspapers, I could bring the heat, and I would write all these articles. And eventually I won a bunch of journalism awards, investigative journalism features. And I was profiled in this daily news supplement in New York with me on some weed whacker algae killer on a lake, Oakland Lake in Queens. And I got to the attention of the mayor's office and they offered me a job in the research department. It's equivalent of, shoveling coal, on the Titanic. Like my job was to take newspaper clips and put them on an 8 and 11 piece of paper. And I would walk them around to City Hall. Right. Mm-hmm. So why that's so important is because I leveraged the fact that I was on the inside to start doing ghostwriting for the mayor of New York. At the time, is Mayor Giuliani, version 1.0, by the way, America's mayor, not the version we currently know. But so I leveraged it and getting to the point of the story. What's interesting about politics, and I tell anybody out there who's listening to this, whatever side of the aisle you're on, politics is equivalent to a tech startup. And then like everybody there's all these jobs to be done. There are not enough people willing to do it. There are not enough people willing to surrender their entire life. If you think that hours at a tech startup are bad, work at an executive level of government, they're insane. But they look past age and background. Like I have to say, in a lot of respects, like it didn't really matter where I came from. Didn't matter that I was living in squalor, that I had a GED. Nobody cared as long as I could write and as long as I would be willing to work within an inch of my life. And so I owe a lot to the political environment for giving me these jobs earlier than any other environment would have given them. I was press secretary for the mayor of New York. I went from scraping gum at McDonald's at 16 to press secretary by 26 years old.
That's remarkable. What do you think, there's so many contributing factors, but what do you think helped you rise so quickly?
If I'm honest, I think the exigent circumstances of desperation were important. I can't remove myself from the context. I felt so desperate, taking care of my mother, so frustrated that the system didn't really care. She was obese and she had all these sort of undefined health issues, but no one ever did anything. And so I would spend nights at the ER sitting on the steps reading my books, even in law school, like just no one ever did anything. So I will say I came to the point of not capitulation, but say, okay, that avenue is closed to me. Nobody cares. And the system is not set up to intervene. And I remember this conversation I had with my mother. I'll never forget it. She was very depressed when I was growing up as a kid and felt very victimized. And she was in a lot of horrific ways, especially as a child. But I would say to her, but like, I don't want to see the world as if I'm a perpetual victim. And she would always say, you don't know what it's like. You're a kid. It's easy for you to say. I said, well, maybe that's the case. And then she would say, but I'm dying. And I would always say, well, we're all dying. And I remember this conversation I had with her and said, from now on, I've decided that I happen to things and things no longer happen to me. And she would say, well, that sounds naive. I have never wavered in that belief that I happen to things and things don't happen to me. And I do think that we all get the last word. So this book that I wrote, Burn the Boats, does try to encapsulate this idea that we have to take agency in our own rescue and that we should never abdicate responsibility, good or bad, for determining the outcome. So perhaps as a little 16-year-old sitting at the table with mom, it was grandiose. But as a 48-year-old with written a book about my career, it doesn't seem so crazy anymore.
I really like that philosophy, and I want to dive into Burn the Boats more in just a moment. But we got to hang on this press secretary for Mayor Giuliani during 9/11. Like, I couldn't even fathom the complications and just uncharted territory of being in a time like that, in a position like the one that you were in. What did you learn about crisis communications and navigating a time period like that?
Great question. And I don't get to talk about this as much as I want to, but everything in that 24-hour time frame, or maybe let's zoom out 72 hours from the moment the attack occurs. Number one, what I was doing between the first plane hitting the tower and the collapse was standing on a corner 3 blocks away on Church and Park, alone with 2 aides, with the building as the backdrop, because we didn't have a sense of the enormity. We all thought it was a Cessna, a small plane at first. You can't perceive. It was like a rotten apple core, and it's black, and you're hearing sounds, and you don't realize later that's the sounds of people dying, like horrific. But you have a job to do, and the job to do is to represent strength and to set a press conference. And that was always the mayor's philosophy, and I credit him for it. I've taken it with me in every context that the first rule of crisis management is to show up. People often raise the bar unnecessarily high. They think that the standard they're held to is to have answers. That's not the further out you go from the catalyst or the epicenter of the disaster, the higher the expectation of the answers you're going to have. But in the early days, there's zero reason not to communicate, because all you have to communicate is we don't know, but we're in the process of finding out. When we do find out, we're going to tell you, and here's how you should feel and maybe think and do in the interim. And so that was always his philosophy. So there were multiple times I've been to a plane crash, unfortunately, twice. I've been West Nile virus was a disease outbreak. I've been to every kind of catastrophe, violence. And the first rule was always to show up and sort of communicate. So that morning, that's where I was standing. But then it became clear as everyone evacuated, and I would see column of firefighters going in, that this wasn't any ordinary crisis. And so I actually, when the first tower collapsed, I was in the process of trying to find my way back to City Hall to find the mayor, because the communication stopped working, and in the building collapsed. And the number one priority was we have to project strength, and we have to do that first press conference. So those who may remember, but you've seen the documentaries, the mayor is asked, Mayor, do you have any estimate of the number of casualties? And he says, we don't know, but what we do know is it'll be more than any of us can bear. And when he said it, it was just so instinctive and primitive, like, that's it. That's the answer. It's what we need to hear. We need to acknowledge that this is unlike anything we've ever been through. And so for me, like, to have been there, and now compare that with President Bush, who, we have all these views of President Bush. I have a personal connection to him. I was around him in very intimate moments. And was always amazed by his incredible memory. Bush had a remarkable memory and was a very actually empathetic human being, whatever you think about his politics. So, but remember when he didn't actually show up for 4 days, the plane was circling, he sort of fed into this narrative that he was aloof. And it was my job to work with the Secret Service and the vice president's staff to arrange the first visit to Ground Zero. And I remember when we decided he would walk through the carnage, and they spontaneously decided to climb up on top of a pile. And he had his arm around a firefighter, and somebody in the crowd yells, "Mr. President, we can't hear you." And he goes to the bullhorn, "Well, I can hear you. And soon the people who did this will hear us too." Wow. And if that actually was the turning point, I'm sharing this for anybody out there who's a marketer or communicator, like, it really matters. Sometimes we tend to think communication or even marketing is an afterthought, but actually oftentimes it's the main event. It's actually the very thing we need. And leaders who are not equipped to do with it, don't feel comfortable, resent it, tend to really suffer during a crisis. And so I just like those moments juxtaposed. For Giuliani, it was instinctive that we needed to show up. We had practiced it. For the president, maybe bad advice, or maybe he was the victim of circumstance. It took too long. But from that moment forward, when he projected strength, everything changed.
I like also that it sounds like he showed up, and he showed up as a human, just like a
He
person
did. He did. It
first.
was well. I had to go with him to the family center. Again, these surreal views. I remember I was in the car behind the car protecting him with the it's like a Gatling gun aimed at my car as I'm following him down the West Side Highway. And we went to the family center, and he's tearing up. He's meeting with all the family. Like he spent the whole day. Very, very sensitive, again, forget about politics, very sensitive human being. But you're right. He showed up as himself, not as a character, not as a president of the United States, as a human, consoling people. Again, most of us, unless you're a sociopath, have a lot of empathy in us. And we raise the bar during a crisis when we should be lowering the bar. We should be connecting with our humanity. By the way, even if you are part of the perpetrator in some way or your company screwed up, like just show up as a human with empathy. Lawyers get in the way. Sorry, lawyers, close your ears. But I'm a lawyer, never practiced. It's just fancy wallpaper right there. But I know enough to know when to not listen to you lovely people, because we tend to overthink the consequences. Well, if you say this, it's admitting culpability. How about the fact that we won't have a company tomorrow? Or somebody was wronged and they're grieving, I'll live with the consequences.
Wow. Now,
didn't mean to go on that tangent. It's just, I just remember all these times in my life when a lawyer would have, like told you what to do or not to do. And then you miss that important moment when you're acting on instinct and on empathy. And lawyers, logically want you to act on reason and forecasting liability.
it's sort of amusing to me that you are also a lawyer and wrote a book called Burn the Boats. It's like the opposite.
Well, yes and no, as we'll get into, because I also am very paranoid risk taker, and you can't work for government all those years and be a lawyer without being it. But yeah, it is kind of funny. And I never practiced a day in my life, which is also in the book. But nothing is ever a waste. I mean, I have managed lawyers, obviously, throughout my entire career. At any moment in time, I'm managing multiple different lawyers. So the fact that I have that education has made me so much better at managing lawyers. I just never wanted to be one.
Let's flash forward. There's so many different chapters to your career thus far. How do we move from politics into the corporate world?
Yes. So I love this topic. Go into the book as well. This idea of leverageable assets, right? That everybody we tend to put ourselves in our own box when we meet our maker or on the brink, and we take inventory of our lives. I'm positive that for most of us, when we reconstruct what happened, how did I end up here or there, you will find at the epicenter not an oppressor, but you will find your inner voice that puts you in a box subconsciously. And so you always have to be intentional to define your life the way you believe it's played out. So what do I mean by that? I could have been a government employee for the rest of my life if I defined my experience as a press secretary as being a government experience. But it wasn't a government experience. It was dealing with the most combative press corps in the country, except for the White House. It was managing complicated facts. It was a million things. It was crisis management. But the context of being in the government was very, very tertiary, right? But I could have defined it that way. And then next thing you know, 20 years later, I'm still in the government, right? So I always zoom out and I ask myself the following question. What are my leverageable assets that I have by virtue of doing this job that I can now use to bring me closer to where I ultimately want to end up? Not where I want to end up, ultimately want to end up, because I believe you just need to move in the general direction of your ultimate ambition. So for me, being a government employee, well, now I know how to manage complicated dynamics. I was also one of the first employees of rebuilding the Trade Center site. So I might have been the first, if not like the third. So I helped oversee that for 2 years. I became chief operating officer. And so everything you see was planned out in the 2 years after the attacks. But my leverageable asset was being able to bring together different constituencies. And I used that to go to a sports team, the New York Jets, that needed to build a new stadium in the middle of Manhattan. In retrospect, not a great idea. But I knew how to navigate by virtue of the crisis. So if you, as we go into my career, if you look at, well, what's the connective tissue? It's the being intentional and identifying leverageable assets and using them to bring me a little bit closer to where I want to end up to this very moment on this podcast.
It sounds like you actually thought a bit about your personal brand. And I think people think personal brand means media interviews and speaking. Of course, that's part of it. But personal branding is also just the impression that you leave on every single person that you meet, your network, what people say about you when you're not in the room. And it sounds like that was a thought that sort of went through your mind even when you were just getting started.
It really has. And to unpack that a bit, first of all, there are a lot of people who are intrinsically motivated by adulation. or the recognition. It makes them feel good. It enhances their self-esteem. I am a total introvert. I just manifest with charisma and some good speaking skills, but like I could be alone in a room for 20 hours. And I need to think. But so then the question, well, what's my why? Why would I be public, or why would I build a brand? And building a brand gives you authority and power to meet your objectives. And I'm always amazed that you have to convince people that, right? So we can go further into that. But for me, it started being clearer and clearer to me that my story is crazy, right? Drop out of high school, end up going to law school at night, all these crazy jobs. But again, who cares? What's the point? Who am I impressing? I realized that the most important thing I'd ever seen in my life and experienced firsthand was the death of my mother, the powerless death of my mother in a world where no one cared and did anything about it. Because I could imagine how it would have changed the trajectory of that little boy's life if somebody had cared. And two, she wouldn't be dead, especially in a world now where with Mounjaro and Ozempic, I don't know how to say it, but the weight loss drug, she would not be dead. And so I never wanted to lose hold of that. But I wanted the authority to make people care in whatever context that moved me. So maybe that's human rights, because I care a lot about human subjugation. But people don't listen to you unless you have authority. And so along the way, the reason for developing my personal brand was so that I could accumulate authority, first to accomplish my own objectives. We all have selfish objectives, but in a bigger way to maybe end up not Elon Musk, but I look at a guy like him who has got this incredible platform and he uses it to peddle Dogecoin. It's like, imagine if you could use it to shine a light, on the Yazidis, right? Am I probably saying that wrong? In Iraq, like there are so many different situations where somebody can use their authority. So my why, my meta purpose has always been, I'm going to accumulate authority through my crazy story so that I could shine a light on what powerlessness feels like. And that has motivated me all the time. So to your question, I have been very calculated about my personal brand. I've been very calculated and aware that this is a crazy career, and then I wrote the book to tie it all together.
Yeah, I think that speaks so much to the Shark Tank vignette of you. And I was mentioning this to you before we even started this interview. There was something in those 2 minutes of capturing your life story that was powerful, like raise the hair on the back of your neck, kind of powerful. And I think to tie into your why, burn the boats really sounds like such a strong call to action that sort of summarizes how you've approached your life and your business. And I love in the beginning, the intro of your book, you talk about, generals and leaders within the army who would burn the boats so that there was no way back, right? Like, we're here, we're fighting, we're in it, we're all in. I want to hear from you. How do you think that burn the boats philosophy can relate to branding and relate to business?
Oh, great. So, and maybe I could just give you a minute on why that phrase and the logic of the book back to the architecting. I mean, that phrase, burn the boats, for those who don't know, people think it's attributed to Cortez. He just had a better marketing campaign. He was a very bad man, by the way. He's a genocidal maniac, so you don't want to emulate him. But I was sort of fascinated. This phrase kept coming up throughout my career. And I've always I just loved it. So jingoistic, also so simplistic too, right? Like we need way more nuance than that. But I liked it as an umbrella. And when I researched, I found every culture, most, have a similar story, the hero's journey, where a fabled general was outnumbered. And the way they overcame the enemy was by eliminating retreat optionality and by taking away their food provisions, manufacturing desperation, right? And so I was like, there's a great story. What's fascinating about Cortez, obviously he was a Spaniard, but actually in a 7-Eleven, maybe that's where 7-Eleven came from, but 7-Eleven AD, there was a General Tariq who was Muslim, and he conquered Spain. So I imagine little Cortez as a little boy learning about Tariq, like I'm gonna use that tactic. And then Tariq, it goes back to Caesar maybe in 49 AD. And before him, there's a story in China in 206 BC. And then we go back to the first written appearance of Burn the Boats is in Sun Tzu in The Art of War, that an army burns its boats. So for me, I was like, this is already imbued with authority and it's completely contradictory to everything our parents, tell us. And so I wanted to pull that forward and then actually appropriate it, not for the self-possessed, the arrogant, those who, can go and don't have imposter syndrome, but for the rest of us, like myself, who had to overcome anxiety, shame, imposter syndrome. Actually, on the boat, even though it looks like a little pagan symbol, this is actually meant as a child's boat, recreated and rendered over many, many iterations. It's meant to be floating in my bathtub because that was my boat I needed to burn, was the shame and the sadness of failing to save my mother. So how does it all play into marketing and communications? So the premise isn't really about plan B as much as about, if you want to be as successful, we can get to the science, that you want to eliminate optionality. We are taught to hold two opposing thoughts simultaneously in our mind. Oh, I know you want to be the next Taylor Swift, but at the same time, let's plan for you failing to be the next Taylor Swift. And we're supposed to have them simultaneously, and that doesn't work. So from a communications and marketing standpoint, when you actually aren't fully committed to your plan A, it's going to show up in your language. I see this at Harvard all the time. Like, it's going to show up in your willingness to represent your product publicly. This comes up. There's always a couple of different types of students in the room. There's all sorts of founders. There are those who want to intellectualize their way to their business and solution and would prefer to stay behind the scenes. Like, I don't do social, like I'll just let my product speak for yourself. And then there are other ones who recognize that marketing branding is everything. I personally believe that the act to get somebody to ingest your beverage is audacious. Like, are you kidding? You want me to drink that and not die? And you want me to believe it's good? Like, that's an audacious act. So if you don't represent that act through your personal branding, your willingness to communicate, what's that telling me about it? So I would say to anybody listening who's adopted a mindset of like, I'm going to let somebody else, my co-founder does that, I don't do that. Like, I guarantee you it's showing up in sales. I guarantee it's showing up in the success of your product. And I guarantee it's showing up in the evangelicism of your employees who think, well, if you're not willing to rep it, why should I rep it? That was a long answer, but I love this topic because I talk about it all the time, and people always want to make a choice, like as if it's a choice to whether to rep your product through branding.
Yeah, and I like that you've added this sort of branding marketing specific angle to burn the boats. One of the principles you talk about in the book is a gut sandwich, as you call it, sort of trusting your gut, trusting your intuition. Marketing and PR, there's definitely a strong component of intuition. There's also this push for numbers and measuring impressions and measuring all of these different aspects that help you analyze, what's working, what's not, and how to continue. How would you sort of balance that idea of having a gut sandwich and trusting your gut, but also paying attention to data?
Yeah, it's so hard. I mean, so for those that don't know, the gut sandwich is basically me reconstructing some of these major developments, saying, okay, they started with intuition, but there was no evidence for it. And the magnitude of an opportunity has an inverse relationship with the amount of evidence there is for it, right? Like when Steve Jobs creates the iPod, like he had no reason to believe that we needed 40,000 songs in our pocket, but he wanted it, right? And then he looked for data evidence, but data is not really data. It's actually more evidence of traction, early traction that you're interpreting and maybe sort of applying some, a growth factor to it. Well, there are a few people who are doing this and eventually it could compound, but the green light is intuition with most, major decisions. As it pertains to marketing, it's something I deal with all the time. I love data. I love science. I geek out on studies. I would love to reduce the world to data. I would love to, even in selling the book, make it about CAC to LTV, right? Like 1-3, perfect rate, 3-1, rather perfect ratio. And, but life doesn't work that way. And in fact, the book keeps teaching me this well, because I'm trying to make the process of selling the book, but really communicating about the book, efficient so I can allocate bandwidth. And I'm like, damn, that tactic is the one that worked. Like, that's not supposed to work. I'll give you an example. So logic would dictate that I could spend digital marketing and I could figure out the perfect hack, and maybe it's Twitter will convert or Instagram stories. Everyone's now talking about Reels. Facebook Reels will convert. I've been spending money there, right? All this stuff. And I had a moment of defeat, as anybody who's an author understands this. How many times have you nearly died and capitulated and said, okay, I'm done? And I had one of those moments. And then I was like, no, I'm going to do the thing that nobody else would do, because that is the thing that will bring me closest to the thing that works in terms of getting out. And so I chose to do a radio interview at 1 a.m., 1 to 3, 2 hours live in the middle of America, coast to coast. And it was like, I said, I'm going to stay up for 3 days straight and just do media until I figure out what it was. Out of everything I've ever done around this book, every single major interview, every massive podcast, I've been on some of the biggest ones. The most effective thing was the live radio interview between 1 and 3 a.m. And not a single person in the collective wisdom of the publishing industry told me to do that interview. So that's marketing, right? If I want to rely on data altogether, I eliminate serendipity and experimentation. So me personally, my life is one big A/B test. I'm doing this, I'm doing the opposite. The other thing, as a CEO, I would advise anybody listening, like, there's a reason you're the CEO or the founder. You have a pretty high IQ. You have a lot of grit and gumption, whatever is your magic. If you don't put yourself in the stream of data to get granular insights, you're going to miss the opportunity to figure out what actually works. And so I am ridiculously tactical when it comes to marketing. Like, you'd be shocked. And it's like, it's all day, it's all night, it's different times. I'm constantly experimenting, because if I'm waiting for my team to tell me what they deduce, it's like, it's too far removed. It's not that I don't take presentations and people don't present their plans, but I am sitting there running Twitter ads, LinkedIn ads myself, and boosting Instagram stories,
Wow.
watching, feeling all day and all night.
You're connected.
I'm crazy. But yes, connected would be another word. No, but I deduce things. And so why am I going to deny it? Because there's no precision to it, despite what everybody wants to say. The only reason we're trying to make it precise is because it's gut wrenching otherwise, right? But the truth is, accept the fact that a lot of marketing is gut wrenching, and I don't want to deny myself the benefit of spontaneous insights. And the only way to do that is to be ridiculously tactical. And as a result of being that tactical, I've come up with incredible things that around, especially around marketing in the book, that people wouldn't have expected. I'm launching something actually tomorrow that I'm so excited about, that no one's ever done. And I wouldn't have figured it out if I wasn't tactical.
Amazing. What is one other story, lesson, principle that you share in Burn the Boats that you feel exemplifies a lesson for people looking to build notable, recognized brands?
Okay, great question. So I speak more to the leaders and the people who are a little bit reluctant, or those who have naysayers around them and feel a little bit vulnerable. When I went on Shark Tank, of course, you have to have a personal brand and you have to communicate. For a long time, I was like dormant because I had my head down. And then out of nowhere, like shot out of cannon, I started sharing my crazy story. And it was a change of behavior. And what was fascinating is a lot of people around me were put off by the change in behavior, number one. So what I mean is, embracing Instagram stories, going live, doing whatever. So the act of stepping out and creating the brand provoked people. And of course, you're like, what do you care? Like, get out of my face. But that's number one. Number two, people ascribe motive to your behavior when you step out and you start doing personal branding. They want to assume that you're an egomaniac, or you're doing it for self-aggrandizement, or you're being selfish. You're not being a team player. So it's a second threshold that you sort of have to overcome and you have to block out. And then third, you're being very vulnerable. And so so that's the backdrop, right? Like, I have to go through this, this birthing of a brand that had been dormant while I kept my head down. And then when I successfully got on the show, which is his equivalent of American Pie, the number one business show in the world that kids watch with their mom and dad, there's like nothing negative about Shark Tank. It provoked a lot of resentment, and really was a lot hard to absorb. And so my message to anybody out there, if you haven't built a brand before and you're worried that people are going to judge you, you're right. They are going to judge you. And the reason they're judging you is, one, they don't feel comfortable doing it. Two, you're breaking the mold. And a lot of people feel like that's very threatening because maybe they want to stay placed. They would like you to fail. So I'm saying that only to a little bit of smelling salt for anyone listening, is like, damn right, it's going to be uncomfortable. And you got to block it out because you're going to deny yourself your opportunity to excel. So, and again, when we use the word personal brand, it's so calculated. It can be a little cringy. It's not really about personal brands, but showing up in the world, and showing up in 2023 or in every year from now on. Showing up includes being heard, having the confidence to rep yourself and what you're involved in, and being able to engage transparently. And if you can't do those things, you may not be left behind in 2023, but you'll be left behind in 2030 for sure. I'm giving you 7 years to get your shit together. So that's why
You better get on it.
better get on it.
As a shark on Shark Tank, also as the CEO of RSE Ventures, you invest in a lot of companies. You invest in a lot of entrepreneurs. Fundamentally, what is it that you look for in that company and in that person?
Yeah, great question. I would say let's talk about the person, because I think the person is more interesting even than the company. Because as an investor, you realize every time you write a check, you basically signed up for a job. And so I'm always evaluating the opportunity cost, even more than the opportunity, to be honest. I'm now more defensive. Like, what are you going to screw up about my life? Because now you have expectations about me. You're also concealing how bad things really are. It's like a lot of it is like sleuthing to figure out what's the opportunity cost. And the way to mitigate the opportunity cost is for me to back the right kind of people who have a balance of two seemingly opposing qualities, but they're actually synergistic. And one is confidence and the other is humility. And the reason why those two matter is success is also ultimately determined by the pivots that you make along the way and when you make the pivot. I can predict a founder or CEO's success by the amount of time it takes for them to pivot or adapt from the moment that when it became objectively necessary. Now, of course, that's a subjective view, but I'm going to call it objective. Like, no, you're going to die. Like, if we don't change the course, your product sucks, or we're about to be cannibal. You don't make that pivot. The longer you wait, the harder it will be to avoid the iceberg, right? Extending the boat metaphor. But so that's number one. And the way to ensure that a CEO or founder will make those pivots is confidence, humility, confidence to go ahead and to look within and audit and be open and receptive to the possibility of failing, and the humility to acknowledge that things do go wrong. And I can go ahead and I'm going to do something about it. So I look for little signals and tells of those two qualities. And then in terms of what do I choose to back, I look for things that can be outrageously large. That's not always obvious, but at least I want to be able to connect the dots to say, like, I think this could be huge. It's like, to put it in a Shark Tank context, like if you would do a deal on Shark Tank and all of America is watching in the world, right? Let's say 3 million people tune in to watch that episode, but yet it's a brick and mortar location in New York. That means out of all those 3 million people, the only time they could experience it if they happen to be, it's like a waste of impressions. So my view going into the show is scalable and available. Is it available to everybody watching? And can it be global? And that is generally the way I look at, investing, not nearly with as much precision as I'm making it sound. I focus way more on the two qualities. And last point, I talk about this in the book. Italians have a great phrase. I'm not going to say it in Italian because I'll ruin it. But in English, it's the fish rots from the head. So I think so many institutionalized investment firms, private equity, because it's more scalable, focus on data and the numbers, when in reality, the CEO's mindset, psychology, their context, everything is going to have a way bigger impact on the business than the numbers.
I'd love your take on the importance of a founder's personal brand. So let's talk about startups, for instance. Startups are just trying to get their name out there. They're figuring out product market fit. They're doing all of these things. Do you believe that it's important for the founder to simultaneously be building and intentional about their personal brand?
1,000%. And I know not everybody does. And a lot of people reject. 1,000%. At a minimum, it's a waste of a potential asset, right? Let's take two different products. Those of you who don't know me, but don't know this brand, Google it. You'll see what I'm talking about. But let's talk about Milk Bar. It's run by Christina Tosi. Christina Tosi is brilliant, amazing, effervescent. Created this brand with David Chang at Momofuku. I'm the largest, shareholder. And she could show up anywhere on Instagram Live, Bay Club, on a TV show, and she will light up the room, right? So now let's A/B test her in a nameless, commoditized, cake, right? Like, obviously, Christina will give an advantage because we connect with people. And we obviously love our brands, but when they're led by somebody who reflects our values or who's aspirational, it makes it easier, makes us more evangelical. So, like, of course, it should be that. But I think it's even deeper than that. I think that the most successful companies and products are a natural expression of the person who created them. And I just love backing things that are where I always use these words where it's not that the founder intellectualized what I call like a sleepy TAM, like, oh, there's no one addressing this large TAM, total addressable market for those playing at home. And I'm going to create this company because I have an MBA from Harvard, but I could care less about the underlying sector, right? versus a founder. Lola is a good example, right? They decided to address feminine care. They were very passionate about the things that we were putting in their body, horrified by the ingredients. Like, it's a natural extension of who they are as human beings. The best businesses, and why it matters, it's not just like philosophical. For me, it's like structural integrity of the exercise. Oh, it was born from a good place. You have insights from your life and context, but also your motivation will be impacted because you care on a primal level. And it's not something that you put on a spreadsheet so you get rich. It's because like you were put on this earth to do it. So not all of the checks I write fit that, but the ones that I love the most are the ones where the founder was motivated, because then we bleed together and we almost die together. We resurrect together. Those to me. So back to brand. You should be so effing excited and care so much about the brand that you rep this. I have not always felt that way in my life. I vote. I sometimes have been tentative. This book is the expression of that to me. Like, I would die to get this book out there. Like, I don't want to, but when I wake up and I get a DM from somebody around the country who feels like they were unseen, or they don't have a dad who is supporting them, or a spouse who's undercutting them, and like they read my book and they feel empowered, like, what's that worth? And so that enables me to speak effortlessly in any context, take any incoming. You could try to cut me down to pieces, criticize the book, but because I care so much about it, it doesn't matter. That's, to me, those make the best founders.
Let's talk about strategic partnerships. You have partnered with many people, many companies, notable figures like Gary Vee, invested in companies like Momofuku and RSE. How do you approach collaboration and strategic partnerships to help enhance overall brand value?
From a very calculated way, or how do I approach partnerships, would you say?
Let's talk both.
Right. Well, let's talk big picture partnerships, right? I talk about in the book a lot about, first question that people fail to ask is like, do I need a partner? A lot of partnerships, I would say the majority of partnerships are born of insecurity at a moment of time that's fleeting. So give you the fact pattern. I'm a founder. I'm looking to disrupt a new industry, but I'm not from this industry. So I feel a little nervous because I don't know what I don't know. And so I seek a co-founder. What do? I go to the industry that I'm looking to disrupt and I get a co-founder. So that makes me feel good in the formation phase. Maybe it makes investors feel a little bit more confident to give me a check, right? But then time goes by and like, you kind of annoy me, like, because you represent the very things I'm trying to destroy, and you keep trying to pull me back to convention. So that's one of many fact patterns of partnerships that were born with impure motive, or at least motive that wouldn't endure through the duration of the partnership. Second issue, I asked students are always fascinated in my Harvard class to ask co-founders, like, how did you choose each other? And it's my favorite part of the class because the answer they get is always the exact opposite of what they believe is the answer they need. And they assume that people choose partners because of skill gaps, and you're looking to backfill skills that you don't possess. I'm the marketing person, and I need the numbers guy, and without question, what the co-founders always say is that you choose a partner based on value overlap, not skill gaps. Skill gaps actually secondary. And the reason why companies succeed or fail with how they weather crisis, and when you have value overlap, you're going to approach the crisis the same way. And I've pressure tested this, but what if none of you can even do math? Like, you have to use an abacus. And they're like, so one of us will learn math. But the more important thing is that we agree how screwed we are that we don't know math. You know what I mean? So I think, put that off to the side. I love talking about partnerships because I've entered so many bad investments where I could sniff out that the partnership wasn't great, or I benefited from it by buying one out, whatever it is. And then in general, the kinds of people I look for are those who over-index on self-awareness. Self-awareness to me is the greatest arbitrage entirely within our control, because you can invest in it, work at it. And the reason why self-awareness is important in a partnership, everybody knows what I'm about to say when I'm saying this, is you've all been in this situation where, like, your partner is doing something that is either destructive to them or to the business. But you can only deal with so much conflict because you're dealing with other crap, and you don't want to say it, but you wait longer and longer. I call these the missing conversations. I didn't come up with that term, from the Navy SEALs, but these missing conversations, right? And then eventually you expend your political capital, emotional capital, and you confront your partner. But if your partner already over-indexed for self-awareness, they would be constantly auditing, and all it would take would be a single trigger or a comment to be like, Bob, like, just to be clear, like, you seem like you're not yourself because you're kind of an asshole. You know what I mean? And Bob's like, to be honest with you, I'm in the middle of going through a divorce and I'm taking it out on everybody. You're right. I'm going to go take a break. You know what I mean? Like self-aware people, one, create space for other people to be vulnerable by sharing their own vulnerabilities. But two, they're not afraid to look within because they're well constructed. And so the single greatest problem I find that I deal with founders, out of any, if you would ask me, what's the number one challenge you have? It's cultivating self-awareness and convincing somebody that it's missing and doing the hard work to do it because it scales better than any other attribute.
I really like that.
Yeah.
Matt,
Well, people make fun of me because I'm all about the industrial psychologist. So, but it's just the way I'm wired. I think they could make a huge impact.
I want to move into our MicDrop lightning round. I've got a handful of quick questions for you here to really bring this home. All right. Complete this sentence. To me, building a notable brand means
a brand that stands for something and it doesn't take you 10 sentences to explain it.
What has been a memorable mic drop moment for your brand? This could be for a company that you've worked on or personally.
When I dropped out of high school, as much as I now tidy it all up in the book, it was one of those decisions where you say, well, this is actually very crazy and very lonely. I had, in order to be able to go through with it, I had burned the boats by failing every single class except for typing as a little kid so that the system would write me off eventually. And they did because the interventions were exhausting and they were defeating my conviction. So imagine a kid who had done well and is now a dropout, or about to be. So when the day came, it's the equivalent of the academic walk of shame. You have to take your book, your textbook, and you walk into each room and you're like, so in mine, I walk into my science room and I'm like, hi, Mr. Rosenthal. He doesn't look away from the class. He's like, what's this? I'm like, it's my textbook. It's unopened, wise ass, right? And then he, without missing a beat, looks at the room and says, Higgins, what a waste. I'll see you at McDonald's. And everyone's laughing at me and I'm Irish, I'm red. And I'm like, meanwhile, I'm like, she's totally right. And as I'm about to walk out, no bullshit, this has happened. I grab the door and I stop and I say, Mr. Rosenthal, if you see me at McDonald's, it's because I bought it.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was my mic drop.
Yeah. Now, that was my mic drop moment. And I love it because the truth is I kind of agreed with him, but I'm like, F you. I'm not going to let that be the last thing I ever hear in this building.
Yeah. It's funny how you burnt the boats on your high school education. You just set it all on fire. You did nothing. You went from being a good student to just doing nothing. So you cut that option entirely from continuing.
Well, it is again, it's not hindsight. Somebody wrote me the other day a comment. I love the negative comments. So this is hindsight behind. So I'm like, no, I lived it. I deliberately set fire. And that's why I don't use the reason why I share the full context of the story. It would be easier for me to presume oh, you were a kid gone wrong, but you made good, right? But that's not a useful part of the story. That's not true. It was intentional, but the part that's meaningful was the self-sabotage and how painful and how lonely. And here's Mr. Rosenthal on the front line, right? Reconfirming you're a piece of crap. And he was a nice guy, by the way, but you are a loser. And what it would take to overcome that formula was when I went back to my prom a year later, everybody listening to this, I had my sort of them apples moment from Good Will Hunting. If you ever saw the movie, I went back to my prom. I was now on the debate team, president of the debate team, had a 3.4, 3.5 at college. I was working still 2 jobs, but now I'm in college. And the look on his eyes, I always had a supportive homeroom teacher who I never forget her. She was watched over the land of misfit toys, kids with a beeper doing dealing drugs, all of us little misfits, me with my head down, sleeping on the desk. And she was proud. And Mr. Rosenthal was like, all right.
Respect.
So, right. That's what I'm saying. So, I love sharing the moment because then when I went to law school, my degree is right there, fancy little $200,000 piece of wallpaper, right? When I said I don't want to go be a lawyer, I had a conversation with the law firm and I was about to start as a summer. I was like, can I just ask you? No, I was actually supposed to start the job. So when I outcompete my colleagues, God bless them, love them. But when I outcompete them, how long will it take for me to make partner? The typical partner tracks 11 years, but you can get there at 7 or 8 if you do really well. I was so 7 or 8 years of looking over documents in a basement with a highlighter. And I was but I already make more money than a starting lawyer. And because I had gone through that burn the boats moment already when I was 16, it was effortless to walk away from law school. But more importantly, it wasn't that I didn't go become a lawyer, is that I never took the bar exam, even though I was on law review and top of the class. Because I was like, I don't even want to doubt this is the right. Now to this day, I'm like, damn, I wish I had kind of done that. But there was a utility to giving myself no option to do that. And look how it all turned out, right? So some people will say, this is you tidying up your life. Like, you could say that, but it's not true.
That was just filled with mic drop moments.
Oh,
I just need to get you this.
Okay,
I need to get you a mic.
I didn't know if it was clear.
I loved it.
You can edit it down, so it was like a mic drop moment.
I love all of those moments. Matt, what's one brand that you admire and why?
I'm going to say Apple, because when Steve Jobs died, I didn't think Tim Cook had what it would take to continue that legacy. I really thought it was more of a cult of personality. And here we are years and years later, and they continue to be Apple, and they are disciplined, and they've rolled out new products. They just continue to be Apple. So I think it's shocking when I thought it was actually, because if those who know the history, Apple almost went under, right? And it took one person, Steve Jobs, to right the ship. So I presumed that with the absence of that person, that it would enter into a period of decline. And it's done the exact opposite. So I think Apple is the best brand on earth, but probably the best run company on earth of that magnitude.
What are 3 resources you'd recommend to someone looking to build their personal or corporate brand?
So number one, I think LinkedIn is incredibly powerful and still underestimated, because it is the only platform where you can go viral. So LinkedIn's important for a number of reasons. One, to develop reach, but 2, it's to reach the people that you probably want to reach more than you even realize. You're spending all your time on like Instagram or other nonsense. So I would say make sure you're on LinkedIn, and also testing out your confidence to don't just be on it, post on it at least once to twice a week. So that would be one. So LinkedIn. 2, I think YouTube Shorts are going to be huge, and will eventually inherit the landscape after TikTok runs its course, which I think it is running its course, and TikTok will, I believe, be prohibited within probably 2 years to 3 years. So I would say YouTube, and then the last thing is less about personal brand. It's more about understanding all the tools that are available to put yourself out there, and that's Twitter Threads. I love Twitter. I think Twitter is the land of hate otherwise, and vitriol and cortisol, but I love Twitter Threads. And so back to my point about me being incredibly tactical, I think strategy is actually very overrated. I would stay very tactical around AI tools, and I go deep into Midjourney and to Pictory and to like every kind of tool out there. I'm constantly playing with it because it's real time. And a lot of those tools are really about enabling communication and your personal brand and how you show up. So anybody listening here who's like, well, I don't have like a marketing person, or I don't have somebody to film me or make my videos. And the reason why I'm landing here as my third point is because I would imagine anybody here who doesn't have a brand or believes they don't have a brand is using the excuse is that they don't have the resources to have a brand. And in reality, that's not true anymore. And you're doing yourself a disservice. And the only way I could prove it to you is for you to read the Twitter AI threads about content creation. And you will realize that you 100% have the ability without a single employee to build a massive brand and to get it out there.
What's up and coming for you, Matt? Where can people connect with you? Where can they burn the boats?
Well, any moment I'm doing a ton of things. So I think what I'm excited about right now is I had a new TV show that I worked really hard. Anyone out there saw the show House Hunters? Really cool show. I partnered up with Mark Burnett to create the similar version of that in a business context where I present people 3 different options of a business to buy. These are people who want to buy a bit. Love the show. Shot it for 10 weeks. I killed myself. And then it never aired because CNBC went in a different direction and basically canceled their primetime slate. So I was like, oh. So this is what I always do when things don't go right. I was like, well, I'm going to create my own production studio. So Gary Vaynerchuk and I and Eric Wattenberg, we launched our own production studio so we can do reality programming. I'm going to be doing a lot of business programming. So if anybody hears this and you have a brilliant idea for a business show, DM me. In terms of where they can find Burn the Boats, it's available on Amazon. I also do speaking about it, which I love. And I spend probably the most amount of my time on LinkedIn. So if you want to find me, DM me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I encourage all of our listeners to pick up a copy of Burn the Boats. It's an inspiring call to action to take big risks with your life and with your business. And I think it just leaves you so encouraged reading it.
Well, thank you. And I'm so excited to watch you build your business. You've already built the most incredible studio look. And I know you're going to go to big places. As somebody who's built agencies from scratch and taken it to incredible places, I know you're going to do the same thing. So thanks for having me.
That means a lot, Matt. Thanks so much for being here. Totally energized by this conversation. I know our listeners will be as well. Thanks very much for your time.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Get Mic'd. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. We're excited about continuing to bring forward more conversations with thought leaders on what it takes to build a notable brand. We'll see you next time.